So we're going to switch over to our last speaker before we break into the panel discussion, who is Lydia Bourouiba from MIT. She's an expert in fluid mechanics, and we've asked her to tell us about and summarize what we know about how far these droplets and aerosols spread. So, Lydia?
Thank you. So I'll be talking about, that is not the first slide. So. All right, I'll start. So I'll be talking about the transport of droplets, and I'm Lydia Bourouiba, Director of the Fluid Dynamics of Disease Transmission Laboratory. If you can just go to the first slide, that would be great. And I would just want to start with, next slide. I want to start with a perspective that since the beginning of the century, we have already went through a number of emerging and re-emerging infections, respiratory infection in particular. So SARS was a massive event. H5N1 was a big scare. H1N1 was a pandemic. MERS, another coronavirus that we have dealt with. Ebola was not a respiratory virus, but was infected, transmitted through many routes. And of course, COVID-19. So my hope with this workshop, and also with the lesson learned from COVID-19, is that not only we will build resilience for facing the coming pandemic still that will continue probably for another year, but also to be able to be better prepared for, unfortunately, what could be additional emerging and re-emerging diseases in the coming century. We're still not, next slide, we're still not out of the woods for COVID-19, hence the importance of understanding these transmission routes and the important role of this workshop. Next slide. There have been a lot of investments in the research at the microbial scale, the immunology, pathogenesis, understanding how viruses infect a cell and how that interacts. And that's really critical for understanding treatment and vaccines. There have also been a lot of investments at modeling and data analysis now with the improvement of computing powers at the population level, at the epidemiology level. But where we have not invested and where we have still a lot of gaps is really this intermediate scale where the crux of an epidemic, the event that is really driving an epidemic takes place, the host-to-host transmission process. And that's really the scale where we live, the scale where space and time matters, and it's also the scale in which fluids dominates. And fluids here define both gaseous phase, so the air we could exhale or inhale, the ambient air, ventilation, and also liquid phase, so droplets, liquid lining, etc. So why does this intermediate scale matter? It matters because it connects the two scales that we talked about earlier, so it could enable very powerful multi-scale modeling, but it also matters, next slide, because we can, in fact, we live in a world that's dominated now by measures that drive exactly that scale. Next slide. So, for example, we have heard in the beginning, so if you can play, press one more time to play the video.
Is this airborne virus or it's just droplets?
This is droplets.
So we were told that droplets are the main routes of transmission, and we have heard from prior talks the different basically classifications of the transmission route. And this is a very important concept that is driving a lot of the control measures that we have. So where does that come from? Next slide. This comes from the work from the 1930s, in fact, by Wells, that introduced this dichotomy between the large drops and the small drops, or at that time called them droplet nuclei. And at that time, he really introduced this notion where we emit isolated droplets that come out. And he did a simple timescale computation. If the drops fall faster than they evaporate, there will be large drops, typically above 100 micron. If they evaporate faster than they fall, that would be small drops, subsequently called aerosols. In fact, Wells was building on a legacy of work from the 1800s, started by Fluge and eventually as well Luchenko, who did experiments where they measured, particularly for the drops that settled on agar plates, how far they could still detect colony counts from emissions from human subjects. And they did it for coughing, sneezing, talking, for all the emissions. And they systematically found these distances of 1 to 2 meters that we are talking about today. But the key point is that when Wells introduced this notion, he really established, next slide, this notion that we are emitting isolated droplets that come out on their own. And with that naturally comes the next question, next slide, of what are the droplet size distributions, therefore, that we're emitting, because we would want to classify them into these different routes that now are established as this dichotomy. The problem, next slide, is that this dichotomy makes it very hard to reconcile certain observations with this binary view of the routes of transmission. Next slide. So let's look at what actually happens for an example of respiratory emissions. Next slide. This is a video where we can reveal now with modern instrumentation things that we couldn't see with the naked eye. And what you see here, for example, for violent exhalation, in this case a sneeze, but similarly for coughs, is that what we emit are not, in fact, isolated droplets. They are a continuum of droplet sizes, and they are not isolated in the sense that they are emitted, in fact, embedded in a gaseous cloud. A gas cloud is simply the air that we exhale at different momentum levels, depending on the type of exhalation. And this is very clear when you contrast this, next slide, to for example, what happens to the very, very large drops at the bottom right. And they're the minority of the emissions. Those could be seen as being basically following an isolated dynamics of semi-ballistic trajectory, in great contrast with what happens with the gaseous cloud that is in fact turbulent, that is moist and hot, and that embed a continuum of droplet sizes. So why is this important? Next slide. Because this cloud is in fact, one more time, is in fact emitted in a conical shape. It is high momentum, high Reynolds number, which I'll come back in a moment to. It is multi-phase. It contains a gaseous phase, a liquid phase, charged drops, and eventually solid phase with droplet nuclei. In fact, it changes dramatically the range reached by the drops of almost all sizes, except the very large ones, but also their physics of evaporation. And so for this early stage of emission, in fact, the droplet sizes are not as critical to shape that range, but they become critical for the second phase after this cloud has sufficiently slowed down for venting and dispersal then occurring. So I'll come back to that a bit later. But to refocus on this cloud, what we see and what we have measured and modeled and verified is that this emission is a point source. The cloud is moving forward because it is turbulent with eddies. It's entraining ambient air within it. As it's entraining ambient air, it is also slowing down. And when we know the initial conditions of droplet sizes and the cloud dynamics, we can predict how much stays in the air, how long, and how far, and what stays on surfaces. And that's a way that makes it very hard then to reconcile with just an isolated dichotomy of emission. And we're faced, therefore, next slide, with in some sense a paradigm shift between the isolated drop picture, where if there is no background airflow, if we ignore ventilation and background airflow, then only the large drops could reach certain distances of 1 to 2 meters, even if we gave them all the impulse of the exhalation. The small ones below that size, below the 100 micron size, would not go anywhere because of the drag, the air resistance. Only with the presence of airflow would they be able to move in that early stage. However, we don't need even background airflow to disperse them in a concentrated packet through exhalation from the lungs, because we generate our own drafts from these emissions. That airflow is in fact trapping these drops and flipping the order, because the ones that would have been stopped by drag are the easiest one to in fact carry forward and are transported in this concentrated pocket, not diluted in the whole volume of the room yet, into distances that can be quite important depending on the type of emission. And so it's very important to account for that early stage for potentially the high-risk exposure to a concentrated packet, where the evaporation is also affected by the cloud dynamics rather than the droplet sizes. So if we then start thinking about other implications of this, next slide, and ask ourselves, why does this matter? I just mentioned a couple of times, but more concretely, next slide.
So what is the advised distance we should keep to avoid this contact with droplets?
We advise 1 meter distance. So that's what we can say at this moment.
So next slide. So here we were also talking about social distancing, one more time, social distancing measures that would occur. We talked about 1 meter, 2 meters, 1.5 meters, depending on the countries. In fact, what you see here is a visualization, same thing, using methods that reveal what you cannot see with the naked eye, typically of a violent exhalation from an average normal, completely normal person, where you see how the cloud is in fact moving forward, carrying again, trapping its payload with the droplets within it over wide ranges of distances. In this case, it's a violent exhalation from a sneeze. And you see that there's really no barrier here, particularly of 1 to 2 meters. And the pocket that is moving, in fact, remains laden with liquid droplets for quite some time because of the physics of the cloud governing that. Next slide. So it becomes very difficult to reconcile with the dichotomy of large versus small, and it shows the importance of thinking about this more holistically with a continuum and the full physics for this early stage of dispersal. So I want to now focus on the universality of this. So next slide. What I showed you here as examples are the most violent exhalations, for example, sneezing, coughing. But in fact, the physical process for other type of exhalation, like talking, breathing, singing, is very similar. We always emit a gas cloud laden with a continuum of droplet sizes. Now, the range of droplet sizes can be different, and I'll come back to that in a moment. And the key point is that the momentum in the gas phase, which is really what sets this initial range and not the droplet sizes, is also different. And in fluid dynamics, we have a universal number that we use to quantify the momentum or energy imparted to these flows, for example, the Reynolds number. And so the higher the Reynolds number, the more energy is in that flow, the more dispersal we would expect. That's the case of coughing, sneezing, with Reynolds number on the order of 10 to the 4. But if we go smaller, in the smaller range, in fact, even breathing is on the order of 1,000, which is high enough for these emissions to still remain valid in terms of description as that point source cloud that is still moving, embedding ambient air, and slowing down as it moves forward, carrying forward its own droplets. Talking is more of a pulse, but still pulses, depending on what is being discussed, that still would be embedded with basically what we would call a puff of a slightly lower Reynolds number, but sufficient to still propulse eventually, if we are repeatedly saying that, over the same type of ranges as, for example, breathing. So the difference of the physical description still can be the same as what I described earlier. We don't need to put sort of a random diffusion and a dilution across the whole room in these early stages of the emission. But what's different, next slide, is of course the range reached, and we're talking about then for breathing, even though it's still a high Reynolds number flow, the overall momentum imparted would make it reach maybe just up to 2 meters. And then for singing to sneezing, depending on strength of singing, we're talking about 3 to 8 meters, depending on the events. Obviously for COVID-19, we have both ranges of symptomatic and asymptomatic subjects. And so the full spectrum here is important. And the cloud still becomes therefore important to describe that range and the physics of evaporation for this early phase. Of course, the droplet sizes are still important. So next slide. And we are interested in knowing more about them, even though the early stage is not where their size matters to govern their ranges. Their size still matters to understand the loads and also what will happen to the virus within them, particularly when the venting process takes over in the secondary stage after the cloud has moved sufficiently and grown sufficiently to have slowed down with respect to the background airflow that then takes over. And I'll come back on that later. So next slide, if we go to droplet sizes, from different emissions. So here, for example, is coughs. I just want to contrast old and new approaches. For example, at the bottom right, this is work from Dr. Maraska for coughs, and then older work from Duguy in the 1940s. We see that the range is basically millimeters to micron. We have very different shapes and produced in part by the differences in instrumentation. If we go to the next slide, what you will see is that if you put together now distributions from all these different studies, you see a wide range of shapes. Next slide. And by trying to decipher the events, what we can reveal is that definitely there are gaps. Some events have received more attention than others, coughing, for example, with respect to others. But if you look here at the x-axis, we're talking about droplet sizes, and in the y-axis, we're talking about concentrations. Even within one emission, for example, coughing, we're looking at a huge variability in amounts emitted. And if we look closely, these studies have considered, for example, symptomatic, asymptomatic subjects for various other viruses. And what we see is that although we have learned a lot, there is a lot to do to try to standardize our approaches so that the differences between studies and methodologies do not overpower the subtle differences that we're trying to get from different emissions. And that's something that we have learned a lot about, but is worth really focusing on to improve. So why does this variability come from? Next slide. Next slide one more time. In fact, besides the instrumentation methodologies, there is an inherent variability in the breakup process. Dr. Maraska hinted at it earlier, that we have different breakup processes in the respiratory tract. Here I am showing you breakup process that continues to occur outside of the respiratory tract for violent exhalation, where we see droplets that are already formed coming from the tract and drops that continue to form. In spray physics, the physics of atomization of fragmentation, what we know is that what shape a droplet size distribution is 3 ingredients. It's going to be the impulse, what the source of energy, in this case is the air, the momentum of the air, the geometry, and the fluid properties, whether it's viscous, scholastic, or Newtonian, and how. And here, clearly, we have variability in the physiology, which shape the air in particular, and variability in the properties of the mucosecretion, mucocellular secretion, and liquid lining in health and infection, and in a subject over time. And all these things contribute to their variability, hence the importance to really standardize the measurements and the approaches for coming studies so that we don't drown that with variabilities in the measurement approaches. Next slide. So I talked to you here about about the first part about the short range emission, the range where we're talking about, not short range, I say short time, it's not really short range, emission where the cloud is moving with its concentrated payload. And that's really important concept. It's not diluted in the room yet. So it's a high risk situation where you could have that concentrated packet. The drops are delayed in their evaporation with respect to what would be predicted with their size because of the moisture of the cloud. And that's on the order of seconds to minutes, 2 to 8 meters, depending on the type of emission. And then when the cloud has slowed down, we transition into indoor air venting dynamics dominated. And that's where it's really critical to then think about the venting that takes over in dispersing and diluting at the room scale for now half an hour to hour scales, depending on the venting, the process, and managing strategies of reopening and infection control that embed these two ends of the process. Next slide. One more time. And in fact, here what I want to finish on is that these measures are then diverse when we start thinking about these two ends of the spectrum. We have both the near-field interactions where we can basically focus on source control and that very early range of concentrated emission. And then on the other end, we're talking about approaches to control the longer-term dynamics of accumulation with venting, the winter versus summer conditions, natural ventilations, etc. And just to finish on one example of why the concept of the cloud is also important, next slide. One more time. The source control becomes also a little bit more nuanced when we think about it again about a cloud. So if we're thinking about a mask as just trapping the larger drops that we see, then that would be a good, so in some sense, filter. But when we start thinking about the cloud that still embed the small drops within it, that is in fact potentially leaking from the side, following the path of least resistance, then we start thinking about it as not only a filter, but also a way to minimize the momentum and therefore the range reached by the cloud in a forward motion, but also changing directionality of that emission. And this is one example of how these approaches can be adapted when we have that full physical picture. Thank you.
Well, thank you for that excellent talk. It really tied, I think, everything together really well. So thank you.